The Arizona desert stretched endlessly beneath the scorching afternoon sun, its rugged terrain painted in hues of burnt orange and deep crimson. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At first glance, James Iron Richardson appeared to be nothing more than a weathered 62-year-old rancher, his calloused hands gripping the wooden fence post of his sprawling Mesa Verde Ranch. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind those steel-gray eyes lay decades of classified missions and combat experience. As one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in history, the local cartel was about to learn the hard way that they had chosen the wrong ranch to steal. The sweet scent of desert sage filled the air as James made his final rounds of the day, his boots crunching against the sun-baked earth. Mesa Verde Ranch, nestled in the remote corners of the Sonoran Desert, had been his sanctuary for the past 8 years since retiring from active duty. The 500-acre property, with its modest ranch house and extensive horse stables, represented everything he had dreamed of during those long nights in combat zones across the globe. His faithful German shepherd Shadow trotted beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff the desert breeze. The ranch had been more than just a retirement project. It was a promise kept to his late wife Maria, who had always wanted them to raise horses in the Arizona wilderness. She had passed away from cancer 2 years before he could make that dream come true. But James honored her memory by building the ranch they had planned together. The local townspeople of nearby San Miguel knew him only as the quiet horse rancher who occasionally came into town for supplies. They saw his weathered face, graying hair, and gentle demeanor with the horses, never suspecting that this same man had led some of the most dangerous special operations missions in modern military history. James preferred it that way. The peace and solitude of ranch life were a welcome change from his previous life of constant danger and adrenaline. But lately, troubling rumors had begun circulating through San Miguel. The Sinaloa Cartel, a particularly vicious offshoot of larger criminal organizations, had been expanding their territory northward. Their leader, a ruthless man known only as El Cuervo, the Raven, had been systematically seizing properties along the border region, using them as staging points for their operations. James had heard whispers at Carmen's diner in town, where ranchers gathered for their morning coffee. Properties were disappearing, changing hands under mysterious circumstances. Some owners simply vanished, while others sold their land for suspiciously low prices, their faces haunted by unspoken threats. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James noticed fresh tire tracks near his eastern fence line. Tracks that hadn't been there during his morning inspection. Shadow's ears perked up, his posture becoming rigid as he stared into the gathering darkness. 20 years of combat experience had taught James to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body was signaling danger. Inside his ranch house, James pulled out his worn leather journal, its pages filled with contact numbers he had hoped never to use again. His fingers traced over names, fellow SEALs, operators, and specialists he had served with. Men who had fought beside him in the world's most dangerous places, who had survived against impossible odds. He knew he might need them sooner than he had expected. A distant engine sound caught his attention. Shadow began to growl softly, and James moved silently to the window. In the fading light, he could make out 3 black SUVs approaching his main gate, their headlights off. This wasn't a casual visit. These vehicles moved with purpose, like predators stalking their prey. James felt a familiar sensation washing over him, not fear, but a calm, focused clarity that had served him well in countless operations. His peaceful retirement was about to be shattered, but as he watched those vehicles approach, a small part of him felt almost relieved. The warrior he had tried to leave behind was still there, waiting. Moving to his study, James unlocked a hidden panel behind his desk. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, weapons, tactical gear, and equipment that he maintained more out of habit than necessity. As he ran his fingers over the worn grip of his combat knife, memories of past missions flooded back. The ranch had given him peace, but peace was about to give way to war. Shadow positioned himself by the window, his low growl a constant reminder of the approaching threat. James knew that whoever was in those vehicles saw only what they wanted to see. An aging rancher, alone on an isolated property, an easy target for their expansion. They would soon learn that appearances could be fatally deceptive. As the SUVs drew closer, James quickly assessed his immediate options. The ranch's layout, which most saw as simply picturesque, had been carefully designed with tactical advantages in mind. The elevated position of the main house offered clear sightlines in all directions, while the scattered outbuildings could serve as strategic strongpoints if needed. Even the seemingly decorative stone walls were actually reinforced barriers, capable of stopping small arms fire. Through years of habit, James had maintained a comprehensive security system throughout the property. Hidden cameras covered every approach, and motion sensors dotted the perimeter. He pulled up the security feed on his tablet, watching as the vehicle stopped just short of his main gate. The men emerging from the SUVs moved with a practiced coordination that confirmed his suspicions. These weren't ordinary criminals, but trained cartel soldiers. In the soft glow of his security monitors, James's mind drifted briefly to his last active mission, a classified operation in South America that had pit him against similar cartel forces. He had led his team through that hell and brought them all home. Now, years later, it seemed the cartels had found him instead. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of boots on gravel. James switched to the thermal imaging view on his security system, counting the heat signatures spreading out around his property. 8 men total, moving in a standard search pattern. Their confidence was evident in their movements. They clearly weren't expecting any significant resistance. James allowed himself a grim smile. His time as a SEAL had taught him that overconfidence was often fatal. These men saw what everyone saw. An aging rancher living alone on a remote property. They had no way of knowing that every inch of this land had been prepared for exactly this type of situation, or that their intended victim had spent decades perfecting the art of turning the tables on overconfident opponents. The sound of approaching vehicles faded into silence, replaced by the gentle whisper of the desert wind. In that moment of quiet, James felt a profound sense of clarity. This ranch wasn't just property, it was Maria's dream, their dream. He had protected far less worthy things in his career with far greater violence. If the cartel wanted his land, they would learn what it meant to wake a sleeping giant. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to paint the eastern sky when James noticed movement at his perimeter fence. Through his night vision optics, he watched as 2 men expertly cut through the wire, their movements betraying professional military training. Behind them, more shadows moved in the pre-dawn gloom, advanced scouts for what would undoubtedly be a larger force. In the command center he had built beneath his study, James cycled through his security cameras. The cartel was being methodical, probe-testing his defenses before committing to a full assault. He had to admire their professionalism, even if it was about to be used against him. 3 more teams were approaching from different directions, clearly following a rehearsed plan. Shadow lay silently at his feet, the shepherd's usual playfulness replaced by the focused alertness of a trained military dog. James had worked with similar dogs during his SEAL days, and Shadow's instincts were just as sharp. The dog's ears twitched at sounds too faint for human ears, tracking the movement of their unwanted visitors. The cartel scouts had reached his outer barn, moving with the confidence of men who believed their target was still sleeping peacefully. James watched them through his thermal scope, noting their weapons and equipment. They carried modified AR-15s with suppressors, serious hardware that spoke to the cartel's resources and intentions. A quiet vibration from his phone caught his attention. The text was from Miguel, his contact in town, who worked at the local sheriff's department. Large convoy spotted heading your way. Black SUVs and trucks, at least 20 men, armed. Sheriff's been paid to look the other way. You're on your own. James sent back a simple reply. Understood, stay clear. He had known this day might come, which was why he had maintained certain preparations. In his basement armory, behind a false wall, lay enough weapons and ammunition to supply a small army. More importantly, he had spent years memorizing every inch of his property, marking firing lanes, planning fallback positions, and establishing dead zones where attackers would be vulnerable. The scouts were getting bolder now, approaching the main house. Through his thermal imaging, James could see them clearly, 6 men total, moving in a standard search pattern. Their leader, a tall figure with what appeared to be a radio handset, was directing them with hand signals. These weren't street thugs. Their movement patterns suggested formal military training. A new sound caught his attention, the distant rumble of heavy vehicles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The main force was arriving. James checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. The cartel had timed their operation well, using the pre-dawn hours when most people would be in their deepest sleep. Unfortunately for them, his years in the SEALs had permanently altered his sleep patterns. 4 hours a night was all he needed, and he had been awake and alert since 4 a.m. Through his perimeter cameras, James watched the convoy approach. 5 vehicles total, 3 SUVs and 2 larger trucks, probably carrying additional men and equipment. They were moving without lights, using night vision gear to navigate the dark desert road. The level of preparation confirmed what he had suspected. This wasn't a simple land grab, but a carefully planned military-style operation. The convoy stopped just outside his main gate, engines idling quietly in the pre-dawn stillness. A figure emerged from the lead vehicle, tall, wearing tactical gear that set him apart from the others. Even in the thermal image, his commanding presence was obvious. This had to be the cartel's field commander, probably ex-military himself. Given his bearing and the way others deferred to him, James watched as the commander gathered his team leaders, briefing them with quick, efficient gestures. They were establishing a perimeter, setting up blocking positions to prevent escape. Standard military doctrine, professionally executed. They were preparing for resistance, but their body language suggested confidence. They still believed. They were dealing with a simple rancher. Shadow's low growl deepened as more men began spreading out across the property. James placed a reassuring hand on the dog's head, feeling the tense muscles beneath the fur. "Easy boy," he whispered, "we've got time." He had learned long ago that patience was often the difference between victory and defeat. Let them commit to their plan. Let them think they had the initiative. In his earpiece, a quiet tone indicated that the motion sensors near his south fence had been triggered. More men were moving into position there, probably setting up a secondary blocking force. They were being thorough, professional, and completely unaware that every movement they made was being tracked, recorded, and analyzed by systems they didn't know existed. James allowed himself a grim smile as he watched their deployment. They had brought enough men and firepower to overwhelm any normal resistance, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed he was normal. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, he thought about how quickly their assumptions would be shattered. In the growing light, he could see their objective more clearly. The cartel wasn't here just to threaten or intimidate. They had come in force, prepared for a full takeover. Their vehicles were positioned for a quick exit, and their men were carrying zip ties and body bags. They weren't planning on leaving witnesses. The first direct confrontation came just as the sun cleared the horizon. 3 men in tactical gear approached James's front door, while others maintained covering positions behind his trucks and farm equipment. Their leader, a muscular man with a scorpion tattoo on his neck, carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone used to people yielding to threats. James watched through his security feed as they reached his porch. The leader knocked firmly, not the aggressive pounding of a thug, but the measured knock of someone playing a role. A businessman here to make a deal, albeit one backed by armed men and implied violence. "Senor Richardson," the man called out, his voice carrying a hint of formality that did nothing to mask its underlying menace. "We need to speak with you about a business opportunity. It would be best if you opened the door." James moved silently through his house, shadow at his heels. He had already activated his property's defensive measures, silent alarms that would warn him of movement in blind spots, and carefully concealed cameras tracking every approach to the house. From his current position, he could see 4 more men setting up firing positions around his property. "I hear you've been having financial difficulties," the man continued, his tone sympathetic but false. "We're here to help. My employer is willing to make a very generous offer for your ranch." James had to admire their intelligence gathering. He had indeed been spreading rumors in town about money troubles, anticipating this very situation. The cartel had taken the bait, believing they were dealing with a desperate old rancher who would be eager to sell. "Give me a minute," James called out, his voice carefully modulated to sound aged and uncertain. "Just woke up." He noted how the men outside subtly adjusted their positions, preparing for either compliance or resistance. Shadow stayed perfectly still, years of training evident in his disciplined silence. James moved to his pre-prepared position, checking his exits and angles. Everything was set. Now it was just a matter of controlling the encounter. When he opened the door, he made sure to project the image they expected. An older man in ranch clothes, slightly stooped, looking confused and apprehensive. The leader smiled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Senor Richardson, I am Carlos," the man said, extending his hand. "I represent a development company interested in properties in this area." Behind him, his men maintained their positions, hands never far from their concealed weapons. James shook the offered hand, noting the calluses typical of someone familiar with weapons. "Bit early for business calls," he said, allowing a trace of irritation to enter his voice. "Coffee's not even ready." Carlos's smile widened, but didn't reach his eyes. "This is a time-sensitive opportunity, senor. My employer has authorized me to offer you $2 million for your property. Cash, of course, no questions asked." Behind Carlos, James could see more men moving into position, securing the perimeter. They were professionals, maintaining clear fields of fire while staying out of sight of any casual observer. Their deployment suggested military or police background. This cartel money could buy a lot of experienced talent. "That's quite an offer," James said, playing his role, "but this ranch isn't for sale. It was my wife's dream, you see." He watched Carlos's expression shift slightly, the facade of friendliness cracking. "Perhaps you misunderstand, senor," Carlos said, his voice hardening. "This isn't really a choice. The money is generous, but it's offered only once. After that, things become complicated." James noticed the subtle hand signals Carlos was giving his men, preparing them for possible resistance. They were shifting positions, getting ready to move if needed. Their efficiency confirmed his earlier assessment. These were trained operators, not common thugs. "Are you threatening me?" James asked, letting genuine anger enter his voice for the first time. He saw how they reacted to it, their hands moving closer to their weapons. They were disciplined, but ready for violence. Carlos spread his hands in a gesture of false reassurance. "Not a threat, senor. Simply business reality. This region is changing. Small ranchers like yourself. Accidents happen. Equipment failures, fires. It would be tragic if something happened to your beautiful property." James studied the man's face, seeing the absolute conviction there. Carlos truly believed he was in control of this situation. That intimidation and the threat of violence would achieve his goals as they had so many times before. "I need time to think about it," James said, watching how they relaxed slightly at what they perceived as the beginning of submission. "This is my home, my life's work. You have one." "Our," Carlos replied, his tone making it clear this was non-negotiable. "When we return, you'll sign the papers, or—" He left the threat unspoken but clear. With a final cold smile, he turned and walked back to his men. James watched them withdraw to their vehicles, their movements precise and coordinated. They thought they had won, that fear would drive him to accept their offer. They had no idea they had just started a conflict they couldn't win. As their vehicles pulled away, James closed his door and moved to his command center. It was time to activate contingency plans he had hoped never to use. The cartel had made their move. Now it was his turn. Once the cartel vehicles disappeared down his long driveway, James immediately went into action. His demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the hesitant old rancher, replaced by the calculated precision of a seasoned combat veteran. He moved quickly to his study, entering a code into what appeared to be a normal thermostat. A hidden panel in the bookshelf slid open silently, revealing his command center. Inside, multiple screens displayed feeds from cameras strategically placed around his property. He watched the cartel convoy move down the access road, noting their disciplined formation. Through his high-powered surveillance equipment, he could see Carlos in the lead vehicle, already on his satellite phone, undoubtedly reporting to his superiors about the successful intimidation. "They'll be back in force," James muttered to Shadow, who sat alertly by his side. "And next time they won't bother with politeness." He pulled up a detailed satellite map of his property on the main screen, markers indicating his pre-positioned equipment caches and defensive positions. What looked like ordinary ranch features to others were actually carefully planned tactical advantages. James opened a reinforced gun safe, removing a custom-built M4 carbine and his old service pistol, a well-maintained Sig Sauer P226. These weren't his normal ranch weapons. These were tools he'd hoped to never need again, maintained out of habit and experience, rather than expectation. As he checked his weapons, his mind ran through the tactical situation. The cartel had shown their hand. At least 15 men, well armed and trained with military-style tactics. They would return with more, probably within the hour, despite their stated deadline. Organizations like theirs didn't like to give targets time to prepare or call for help. James moved to a locked cabinet, removing a satellite phone, one that couldn't be traced or tapped. He dialed a number from memory, one he hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Ghostwalker Security, how may I direct your call?" "Authorization code, Sierra Echo Alpha Lima 99, James spoke clearly. "Connecting to Marcus Kane." There was a pause. Then a new voice came on the line. "James, Jesus, I haven't heard from you since Kandahar. What's wrong?" "Marcus, I'm calling in that favor you owe me," James said, his eyes fixed on the security feeds. "Remember that mess in Bogota? I need some of that magic now." "The kind that goes boom or the kind that goes bang?" Marcus asked. "All business." "Now, both, and I need it fast. I've got cartel problems, the serious kind. They're trying to take my ranch, and they're not taking no for an answer." "How many?" "At least 15, probably more coming. Ex-military by the looks of their tactics. Well-armed, well-trained. They gave me an hour to decide to sell. That was 10 minutes ago." "Christ," Marcus muttered. "Okay, I can have a package to you in 30 minutes. Sarah still flying that helicopter of hers?" "Yeah, she's still in the game. Tell her to approach from the north. Use the old mining ravine. They won't see her coming that way. While James coordinated with Marcus, Shadow suddenly perked up. Ears forward, James immediately focused on the security feeds. A lone vehicle was approaching, not from the main road, but from a back trail. He zoomed in, recognizing the local sheriff's cruiser. "Got to go, Marcus. Expect company in 20. James ended the call, quickly securing his weapons out of sight. The sheriff wasn't openly corrupt, but James knew he took cartel money to look the other way. This visit wasn't a coincidence. James resumed his role as the simple rancher, walking out to meet the sheriff as the cruiser pulled up. Sheriff Tom Hayes stepped out, looking uncomfortable in the morning heat despite the early hour. "Morning, James," Hayes called out, trying to sound casual. "Heard you might have had some visitors earlier." "News travels fast," James replied neutrally, studying the sheriff's body language. The man was nervous, his right hand never straying far from his holster. "Listen, James," Hayes said, lowering his voice. "These people, they're not the kind you want to fight with. They own half the county already. Just take their money and retire somewhere nice. It's not worth dying over a piece of land." James noticed movement in his peripheral vision, 2 cartel vehicles appearing at the edge of his property, just watching. The sheriff's visit was being monitored. This was part of their strategy: use local law enforcement to apply pressure, make him feel isolated and hopeless. "I appreciate your concern, Tom," James said carefully, "but this ranch isn't for sale. Not to them, not to anyone." Hayes shook his head, genuine concern mixing with fear in his expression. "They're not giving you a choice, James. Nobody who's stood up to them has lasted long. Just think about it, okay? Think about what's really important." As the sheriff drove away, James watched the cartel vehicles disappear as well. They were trying to psychologically wear him down, make him feel trapped and alone. It was a good strategy for a normal target, but they had no idea who they were dealing with or what he was capable of. In the distance, he heard the faint thrum of helicopter blades. Right on time. The real preparations were about to begin. The distant sound of helicopter blades grew louder as Sarah's Black Bell 407 approached from the northern ravine, exactly as planned. James watched through his binoculars as the sleek aircraft hugged the terrain, using the natural contours of the land to stay hidden from casual observation. Sarah had been his team's pilot on numerous classified missions. Her skills hadn't diminished with time. The helicopter touched down in a cleared area behind his barn, its rotors kicking up minimal dust thanks to Sarah's expert touch. Before the blades had fully stopped, Marcus was already jumping out, followed by 2 men carrying large hard cases. James recognized them instantly, former members of his SEAL team's support unit. "Looking good for an old-timer," Marcus grinned as they clasped hands. Despite the humor in his voice, his eyes were scanning the surroundings professionally. "Brought you some party favors." The men quickly unloaded their cargo, while Sarah kept the helicopter ready for immediate departure. James led them to the barn, where they began unpacking the cases. Inside were the latest military-grade weapons, communications equipment and tactical gear, the kind of hardware that wasn't supposed to exist outside of special operations units. "Latest gen night vision, thermal optics, encrypted comms," Marcus explained, laying out the equipment. "Got you some special surprises too, claymores, motion sensors, and those new micro-drones you always liked. Figure you might need eyes in the sky." James picked up one of the compact drones, barely larger than his palm. "They'll be back. Within the hour, full force this time. No more playing nice." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Figured as much. That's why I called in some friends." He gestured to Sarah, who was approaching with a satellite phone. "Got 4 operators inbound, guys from the old unit. They'll be here in 20 minutes. James began arranging the equipment, his mind already formulating plans. "They've got at least 15 men, probably more coming. Ex-military types, good equipment, solid tactics. They're not amateurs. Neither are we," Marcus replied, pulling out a tablet displaying thermal imaging of the surrounding area. Your property's got good defensive positions. We can work with this. For the next 15 minutes, they worked rapidly to establish a defensive perimeter. The motion sensors were placed at strategic points, while the microdrones were programmed to patrol specific routes. James's ranch was becoming a high-tech fortress. A dust cloud in the distance announced the arrival of their backup. 4 men emerged from an unmarked SUV, moving with the distinctive efficiency of special operations veterans. James recognized them all. Men he had served with. Men he trusted with his life. Command centers this way. James led them inside, where the security feeds displayed multiple angles of the property. They'll likely come in from multiple directions. Their leader, Carlos, is experienced. He'll try to overwhelm us with superior numbers. The team quickly fell into their old roles, checking weapons and communications, while studying the tactical displays. These men had fought together in some of the world's most dangerous places. They didn't need long briefings or complicated plans. Tom, you and Mike take the north sector. James assigned positions. Marcus, you're with Steve on the south. I'll coordinate from here and maintain mobile reserve with Sarah. Remember, they don't know we're ready. Let them commit before we spring any surprises. The men nodded, moving to their positions with practiced ease. Years might have passed, but their training remained sharp. Each one carried enough firepower to hold off a small army, and their experience made them far more dangerous than their numbers suggested. James checked his watch. 40 minutes had passed since the cartel's ultimatum. They would be coming soon, expecting to find a frightened old rancher ready to surrender his property. Instead, they would face a prepared and professional force. Sarah approached him as the others took their positions. Just like old times, she said, checking her own weapon, though usually we were the ones doing the assaulting. You're getting too old for that, James replied, but they both knew it wasn't true. Age hadn't diminished their capabilities, it had only added experience to their skills. Through the thermal cameras, they could see the first signs of movement at the property's edge. The cartel was returning, and they were coming in force. Multiple vehicles were approaching from different directions, their headlights off, despite the growing darkness. Here we go, James spoke into his radio. Everyone maintain discipline. Let them get nice and close before we introduce ourselves. The team acknowledged with clicks on their radios. No unnecessary chatter. They were professionals preparing for battle, each man focusing on his sector and responsibilities. James made a final check of his weapons and equipment. The ranch had been his sanctuary, a place of peace after years of war. Now it would become a battlefield once again. But this time, he was defending something that was truly his, and he had no intention of losing this fight. Shadow took up his position by James's side, the dog's training evident in his focused alertness. The setting sun cast long shadows across the property, perfect conditions for what was to come. The cartel was about to learn a harsh lesson about judging books by their covers. Remember, James spoke one last time into his radio, we're not just defending a ranch, we're sending a message. Make it count. The cartel's assault force approached with calculated precision, their vehicles spreading out to cover all approaches to the ranch. Through his thermal imaging, James counted at least 25 men, significantly more than their previous visit. They moved with tactical discipline, establishing a perimeter before beginning their advance. Carlos emerged from the lead vehicle, now dressed in full tactical gear. He carried himself differently, the pretense of being a businessman completely abandoned. Through the high-powered microphones James had positioned around the property, he could hear Carlos issuing orders in rapid Spanish. 3 teams converging from different angles. James spoke quietly into his radio. They're setting up blocking positions at the north and south access roads. Main force approaching from the east. Marcus, you seeing this? Affirmative, Marcus replied from his position. They've got heavy weapons, looks like RPGs and at least one belt-fed machine gun. These boys came to party. James watched as the cartel forces began their advance. They moved in coordinated groups using proper cover and concealment. Their training was evident in every movement. Under normal circumstances, this would be an overwhelming force against a single rancher. "Let the first team reach the barn," James instructed his men. "Mike, once they're in position, you'll have clean shots at their vehicles. Take out their escape route first." Through his command center screens, James tracked their movement. The first team, led by Carlos himself, was approaching the main house. 2 more teams were circling wide, attempting to cut off any possible escape routes. They were following standard military doctrine for taking a fixed position. "Senor Richardson!" Carlos called out, his voice carrying across the evening air. "Your time is up. Come out now, and you can still walk away from this." James activated the ranch's external speakers, his voice projecting from multiple directions. "You should have done your homework, Carlos. Did anyone tell you what I did before I became a rancher?" The cartel teams hesitated momentarily, confused by the confident response. Carlos raised his hand, signaling his men to hold position. "It doesn't matter who you were, old man. Look around. You're outnumbered. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Actually," James replied, "you're the ones who are outmatched." He keyed his radio. "Light 'em up." Instantly, powerful floodlights activated around the property, temporarily blinding the cartel forces who had been using night vision equipment. In the same moment, Mike opened fire from his concealed position, his first shots disabling the engines of their vehicles with surgical precision. The cartel teams scrambled for cover, but they were caught in the open, illuminated and exposed. Marcus and Steve opened fire from the south, their suppressed weapons picking off targets with methodical efficiency. Tom coordinated with Sarah, using the micro-drones to track enemy movements and relay positions. "Contact front," one of the cartel members shouted in Spanish, firing blindly toward the house. But James's team had already shifted positions, using pre-planned routes to avoid return fire. Carlos demonstrated his experience, quickly reorganizing his men into defensive positions. "Push forward," he commanded. "They can't cover all angles." But that's exactly what James's team could do. Years of special operations experience had taught them how to control a battlefield, how to make a smaller force multiply its effectiveness through superior positioning and coordination. The cartel's attempt to advance was met with precise interlocking fields of fire. Every time they tried to move, they faced accurate fire from multiple directions. James's team had transformed the ranch into a killing ground using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. "They're trying to flank east," Sarah reported from her observation position. 3 men moving through the drainage ditch. "I see them," James replied, activating one of his pre-positioned charges. The explosion wasn't meant to kill, just to disrupt their movement and force them back into the main killing zone. The battle was intensifying, but James's team maintained strict fire discipline, choosing their shots carefully, maximizing the effectiveness of their superior position and preparation. The cartel forces, despite their numbers and equipment, found themselves pinned down and unable to effectively maneuver. Carlos, realizing the situation was deteriorating, attempted to rally his men for a concentrated push. "Everyone, on me!" he shouted. "Rush the house together!" "That's what we wanted," James spoke into his radio. "Marcus, hit the claymores." The pre-positioned mines detonated in sequence, creating a wall of explosions that split the cartel forces in half. The synchronized detonation was precisely calculated to minimize lethal effects while maximizing psychological impact and confusion. In the chaos that followed, James's team pressed their advantage. They had trained for exactly this type of scenario, knowing how to exploit confusion and disarray. The cartel members, despite their training, began to show signs of breaking. Keep the pressure on, James commanded. Don't let them regroup. He watched through his thermal imaging as the cartel forces started to fall back, their coordinated attack deteriorating into individual survival attempts. The first phase of the battle was going exactly as planned, but James knew better than to celebrate early. Carlos was still out there, and men like him always had contingency plans. The real test was yet to come. Carlos proved James's assessment correct almost immediately. The cartel leader had indeed prepared for resistance, though clearly not of this magnitude. Through his thermal imaging, James watched as Carlos directed his remaining forces to fall back to prepared positions while speaking urgently into a satellite phone. "He's calling in reinforcements," James informed his team through the encrypted comm system. "Sarah, get those drones up high. I want eyes on every approach road within 5 miles." The micro-drones hummed quietly as they ascended, their advanced sensors scanning the surrounding desert. Within minutes, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. At least 6, maybe more, heavy trucks by the look of them. "They're bringing in their heavy hitters," Marcus added from his position. "These guys were just the advance team, softening us up for the main force." James studied the tactical display, his mind racing through scenarios. The cartel's first assault had been repelled, but they had only committed part of their force. Now they knew what they were dealing with. Their next attack would be far more deliberate and dangerous. "Mike, shift to the southeast corner," James commanded. "They'll try to use those trucks as mobile cover. Tom, I want Claymores repositioned to channel them into our kill zones." His team acknowledged, moving with practiced efficiency to adapt their defenses. Through the thermal imaging, James watched Carlos organizing his remaining men. Despite the setback, the cartel leader maintained control of his forces, establishing a defensive perimeter while awaiting reinforcements. His military training was evident in every decision. "Shadow, guard," James commanded, and the German shepherd moved silently to a watching position. The dog's ears were perked, tracking movements that even their advanced sensors might miss. Sarah's voice came through again. "First vehicles are 3 minutes out. They're not trying to be subtle anymore, running with full lights, moving fast." James keyed his radio. "Everyone, maintain fire discipline. Let them commit fully before we engage. These won't be amateurs. They're bringing in their veteran operators." The approaching vehicles appeared on the main road, their headlights cutting through the darkness. As Sarah had reported, these weren't the subtle SUVs from before. These were armored trucks built for war zones, carrying men who specialized in overwhelming force. 8 vehicles total, Marcus reported. "I count at least 30 men dismounting. Heavy weapons? They've got 50 cals mounted on the trucks." Carlos was already moving to link up with the new forces through the directional microphones. James could hear him briefing someone, presumably the leader of the reinforcements. "They've got the house surrounded," Carlos was saying. "Professional operators, well equipped. This isn't some random rancher. They knew we were coming." The new cartel commander stepped into view, a tall figure wearing advanced body armor and carrying a modified M4 with all the latest attachments. His movements and the way others deferred to him marked him as someone used to commanding serious operations. "Thermal signatures showing they're moving into assault positions," Sarah updated. "They're establishing fire support positions with those mounted weapons." James watched as the cartel forces began their deployment. They were setting up a proper military-style operation now, with overlapping fields of fire and designated assault teams. This was what he had been waiting for. Let them commit fully before revealing all their defensive capabilities. "Marcus, Steve, hold your positions but do not engage," James ordered. "Mike, same for you. Let them think they've got us pinned down." The cartel's heavy weapons opened up first, their 50 caliber rounds hammering the ranch house and surrounding buildings. They were trying to suppress any defensive fire while their assault teams moved into position. "Incoming!" Tom called out as RPG rounds streaked through the darkness. "Drop your weapons, or we start getting serious." The new commander's response was predictable. He ordered his men to fight harder, to push through. But his words lacked conviction now. His forces had been systematically stripped of their advantages, their confidence shattered by an enemy they couldn't effectively fight back against. "They're not getting the message," Marcus observed, as sporadic gunfire continued from the cartel positions. "Then let's make it clearer," James responded. "Sarah, initiate Protocol Delta." Hidden sprinkler systems activated, but instead of water, they sprayed a non-lethal but highly effective riot control agent. The chemical compound wasn't dangerous, but it made breathing difficult and vision nearly impossible without proper protection. The effect on the cartel forces was immediate. Professional discipline broke down as men struggled to breathe and, some threw down their weapons while others fired blindly in panic. "Multiple surrenders in progress," Steve reported. "At least 12 men dropping weapons." Through his command center screens, James watched as the cartel's assault force disintegrated. The new commander was still trying to maintain control, but his orders were falling on deaf ears as more of his men realized the futility of their situation. "Shadow Guard," James commanded softly. The German shepherd moved silently to watch the main entrance, his training evident in every movement. The dog's alertness was unnecessary now. The battle was effectively over. "Target count?" James asked over the radio. 17 surrendered, Marcus reported. 8 more incapacitated, but not seriously injured. The rest have pulled back or run. The new commander was among those who had surrendered, his expensive tactical gear covered in dirt as he lay face down on the ground. His attempt to overwhelm the ranch with superior force had failed completely. "Sarah, maintain drone surveillance," James ordered. "Make sure our friend Carlos doesn't try to organize another surprise." Through the thermal imaging, he could see Carlos and his remaining men still retreating through the desert. They were running not just from defeat, but from the realization that they had severely underestimated their target. "Secure the prisoners," James instructed his team, "but keep them comfortable. We want them to report back exactly what happened here." The night had turned out exactly as James had planned. The cartel had brought their best. Trained men, heavy weapons, professional tactics, and had been systematically taken apart by a superior force. The message would spread. Some targets weren't worth the cost. As his team began the process of securing the area, James allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The ranch was still his, and more importantly, the cartel had learned a costly lesson about judging situations based on appearances. "All units," James spoke into his radio. "Outstanding work. But stay alert. This isn't over yet. Carlos will report back, and they'll have to decide whether to cut their losses or escalate further." The battle was won, but James knew the war might just be beginning. If the cartel chose to escalate, they would return with even more forces, even heavier weapons. But that was a problem for another day. For now, they had achieved their primary objective, teaching the cartel that some old ranchers were better left alone. As dawn broke over the desert landscape, James and his team began the methodical process of securing their victory. The battlefield, his once peaceful ranch, was littered with evidence of the night's intense fighting. Disabled APCs sat, like wounded beasts, while scattered weapons and equipment marked the spots where cartel members had surrendered or fled. 17 prisoners secured in the barn, Marcus reported, approaching James at the command center. "We've got them separated, by rank and operational role, just like the old days, their commanders being particularly cooperative now." James nodded, studying the drone feeds that showed the surrounding desert. Carlos and his remaining men had disappeared into the landscape, but James knew better than to assume they'd seen the last of them. Men like Carlos didn't accept defeat easily. "Sarah, "How's our perimeter?" James asked through the comm system. "All clear to 5 miles, she responded. "No movement except local traffic on the main highway. But our friends left us quite a mess to clean up." The ranch had held, but the cost was visible everywhere. Scorch marks from the incendiary rounds marked several buildings, while impact craters from the explosions dotted the grounds. The walls were scarred but standing, a testament to James's thorough preparations. "Mike, what's the status on there?" "Equipment." James keyed his radio. "Quite a haul," Mike replied. 4 APCs, though 2 are pretty much scrap now. About 30 high-end rifles, half a dozen belt-fed machine guns, and enough ammunition to start a small war. Plus all their tactical gear and communications equipment. The cartel had committed significant resources to this attack, which meant their failure would be noted by higher-ups in the organization. James knew this would force them to make a difficult decision: accept the loss and withdraw, or escalate to a level that would risk drawing unwanted attention. "Tom, get me a line." "To our contact in the FBI," James instructed. "They'll want to know about this equipment, especially those APCs. Military hardware like that crossing the border is something they track." Shadow padded silently beside James as he walked the perimeter, inspecting the damage and making mental notes of repairs needed. The dog's alertness hadn't diminished. Despite the victory, like his master, Shadow knew better than to relax too soon. "Their commander's asking to speak with you," Steve reported over the radio. "Says he has information you'll want to hear." James considered this for a moment. The commander had proven himself professional, if overconfident. Any information he offered would need verification, but it might provide insight into the cartel's next move. "Bring him to the house," James decided. "Marcus, you and Mike provide security. Sarah, keep those drones up. I don't want any surprises while we're chatting." The commander, when brought before James, was a different man from the confident leader who had directed the assault. His expensive tactical gear was dirty and torn, and his face showed the strain of defeat. But his eyes remained alert, calculating. "Your reputation was not exaggerated." The commander spoke in perfect English, his tone respectful, despite his situation. "I was told you were just a retired American soldier. Clearly that assessment was incomplete. You should have done better." "Research," James replied calmly. "It might have saved you some embarrassment." The commander nodded slightly. "The cartel. They will not accept this defeat easily. Carlos has already contacted El Cuervo. They will send everything they have." "Let me guess," James said. "You're telling me this out of concern for my welfare? Suggesting I should take whatever offer they make next?" "I am telling you because I respect professionals," the commander answered. "What you did here, the preparation, the execution, it was masterful. But the cartel doesn't think like military men. They will come with 100 guns next time, then 200 if that fails. They don't stop." James studied the man carefully. The warning seemed genuine, but it wasn't telling him anything he hadn't already considered. The cartel's resources were vast, and their need to maintain their reputation meant they couldn't simply walk away from this defeat. "Thank you for the warning," James replied, "but you should worry more about your own situation. The FBI will be very interested in those APCs you brought to my ranch." The commander's expression remained neutral, but a flicker of concern crossed his face. The involvement of federal authorities would complicate matters significantly for the cartel. "Marcus, get him back to the others," James ordered, "and check in with our FBI contact. I want to know the moment they can get here to secure these prisoners." As the commander was led away, James returned to his tactical display. The cartel would need time to organize their next move, but that time would work in his favor too. His team had contingency plans for an escalated conflict, and now they had captured equipment to work with as well. "All units," James spoke into his radio, "maintain full security protocols. This wasn't their last attempt, just their first serious one. Next time, they'll come with everything they have. His team acknowledged the order, each member understanding the gravity of the situation. They had won the battle convincingly, but the war was far from over. The cartel would return, and when they did, it would be with a force that would make this attack look like a mere scouting party. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as James supervised the FBI's evidence collection team. The agents moved efficiently across his property, documenting and collecting the weapons and equipment left behind by the cartel forces. Their presence marked a significant escalation. What had started as a local property dispute was now a federal matter. Those APCs are definitely Mexican military issue, the lead FBI agent Roberts confirmed as he examined the disabled vehicles. Serial numbers match a shipment that went missing 6 months ago. This is going to cause some diplomatic headaches. James watched as the prisoners were transferred to FBI custody, each one carefully documented and photographed. The cartel commander had remained stoic throughout the process, but some of his men looked relieved to be heading for federal detention rather than back to their employers. "Any word on Carlos?" James asked, knowing the FBI had their own surveillance, resources in play. Roberts shook his head. "Nothing concrete, but our border sensors picked up some interesting chatter. The cartel's calling an emergency meeting of their top lieutenants. Your little victory here has them rattled." Sarah's voice came through James's earpiece. "Drone feeds showing increased activity along the known cartel routes. They're moving, people and equipment, but staying well clear of our position for now." The FBI's presence had bought them some time, but James knew it was temporary. The cartel would wait until the federal agents left, then return with overwhelming force. They had to use this respite wisely. "Marcus, what's our ammunition status?" James asked over the secure channel. "We burned through about 30% of our stocks," Marcus replied. "But our friends left us plenty of replacements. I've got Mike and Steve cataloging what we can use." James moved to his command center, studying the tactical displays. The cartel's attack had revealed some weaknesses in his defensive setup, areas where their superior numbers had almost gained advantage. Those would need to be addressed before their next attempt. "Tom, how are the repairs coming on the outer walls?" "Almost done with the basic reinforcement," Tom responded, "but we should think about adding some surprise packages to the new sections. They'll probably try the same breach points again." James agreed. The cartel would likely attempt to repeat what had initially worked, just with more force behind it. They would need to make sure those approaches became even more costly. Shadow suddenly perked up, his attention focused on the distant tree line. Moments later, Sarah's voice confirmed the dog's instincts. "Movement at the edge of our surveillance range. Looks like cartel scouts just watching for now." "Let them watch," James replied. "They need to see the FBI here, understand that this isn't just a local issue anymore." The lead FBI agent approached James again, his expression serious. "We've got a problem. Our sources say El Cuervo himself is taking personal interest in this situation. He's calling in favors, pulling in operators from other cartels." This was significant news. El Cuervo rarely involved himself directly in operations, preferring to maintain distance from the tactical side of the business. His personal involvement meant the cartel would spare no expense in their next attempt. "How long do you think we have?" James asked, though he had already made his own assessment. 3 days, maybe 4, Roberts replied. "We'll maintain surveillance in the area, but you know we can't station agents here permanently." James nodded. The FBI's jurisdiction had limits, and the cartel would simply wait them out. He turned to Marcus, who had joined them. "Time to call in some more favors." "Already on it," Marcus responded. "Got 3 more teams on standby. Ex-Delta, couple of Marine Force recon guys. They can be here in 12 hours if needed." Through his command center feeds, James watched the FBI teams finishing their evidence collection. The cartel scouts were still visible on thermal imaging, no doubt reporting everything they saw. That was fine. Let them see the federal presence. Let them understand that their next attack would have consequences beyond the local level. "Sarah, adjust the drone patterns," James instructed. "I want our friends out there to think we've got more aerial coverage than we do. Make them waste time trying to map our surveillance gaps." The day continued with preparation and planning. James's team worked on reinforcing defensive positions while maintaining constant surveillance. The FBI presence gradually diminished as they completed their tasks, taking the captured cartel members with them. "Remember," Roberts said as his team prepared to leave, "we'll have rapid response units on standby, but you'll be on your own for the first hour of any engagement." James understood the implied message. The FBI would help, but not until after the fighting was over. His team would have to hold out against whatever force the cartel assembled. As the FBI vehicles disappeared down the dusty road, James gathered his team for a briefing. The cartel scouts were still watching, and now they would see the federal presence withdrawing. The clock was ticking. "They'll come at us with everything next time," James told his team. "No more testing the waters, no more probing attacks. They'll try to overwhelm us with pure force." His team nodded, their expressions determined. They had won the first serious battle, but everyone knew the real test was still to come. The cartel would return with an army, and this time they wouldn't underestimate their target. Over the next 48 hours, James's ranch transformed from a defensive position into a fortress. With the knowledge that the cartel would return, with overwhelming force, every aspect of the property was enhanced and fortified. The team worked tirelessly, implementing lessons learned from the first major engagement. "Drone feed shows major cartel movement near the border," Sarah reported. During their morning briefing, "They're gathering forces from multiple cells. Thermal imaging suggests at least 50 vehicles at their staging area." James studied the surveillance footage, noting the military precision of the cartel's preparation. They were doing this properly. Now, establishing supply lines, organizing their forces into proper units, setting up command and control infrastructure. "They're not trying to hide anymore," Marcus observed, pointing to the convoy of heavy vehicles moving openly on the desert roads. "That's a statement of intent. They want us to see their strength." The cartel's new approach was concerning, but not unexpected. El Cuervo was known for overwhelming displays of force when challenged. The question was whether they would attack immediately with what they had or wait to gather even more resources. "Tom, how are the new defensive positions?" James asked, switching his attention to the ranch's preparations. "All hard points are reinforced and rigged," Tom replied. "We've got overlapping fields of fire covering every approach, and the new underground tunnels give us mobility they won't expect." Mike's finished setting up the remote weapons stations. The ranch's transformation had been remarkable. What had once been obvious defensive positions were now decoys, while hidden bunkers and concealed firing posts provided the real defensive backbone. Every obvious approach was covered by multiple layers of prepared positions. "Marcus, status on our reinforcements? First team arrives tonight, 4 operators, all experienced in cartel tactics. Second team is on standby, 6 hours out if needed. They're bringing additional heavy weapons and anti-vehicle capabilities." Shadow's ears suddenly perked up, and moments later Sarah's voice confirmed, "Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Not cartel, looks like local law enforcement." James switched to the appropriate camera feed. 3 police cruisers were approaching, including the sheriff's vehicle. This visit wasn't a surprise. The cartel would want to know exactly what they were facing before committing their forces. "Let them come up to the house," James instructed his team, "but maintain full security protocols. They might be wearing badges, but we know who they really work for." Sheriff Hayes led the group, accompanied by 4 deputies. Their attempt to appear casual was betrayed by their nervous body language and wandering eyes. They were there to gather intelligence, not make social calls. "Quite a mess you had here, James," Hayes called out as they approached the house. "Lot of stories going around about what happened." James met them on the porch, maintaining a relaxed posture that belied the multiple weapons within easy reach. "Just had to explain to some folks that my ranch isn't for sale," he replied mildly. "Seems they had trouble understanding English." The sheriff's forced smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, word is they might come back to continue the conversation. Might be better if you weren't here when they do." "I appreciate the warning, Tom," James said, noting how the deputies were trying to survey his defensive preparations without being obvious about it. "But this is my home. I'm not going anywhere." Hayes shook his head, genuine concern mixing with fear in his expression. "This isn't going to end well, James. They're bringing in serious players, professional operators, cartel regulars, the kind of men who don't leave witnesses." "Like I said," James repeated firmly, "I appreciate the warning. Was there anything else?" The sheriff hesitated, then turned to leave. "Don't say I didn't try to help," he muttered, gesturing for his deputies to return to their vehicles. As the police cruisers disappeared down the road, Sarah's voice came through the comm. "They're already making calls. Looks like they're reporting directly to cartel contacts." "Good," James replied. "Let them report what they saw. Everything visible was meant to be seen. The real preparations, the hidden defenses, the concealed bunkers, the emergency exits had all been kept carefully hidden. The cartel would come expecting a reinforced position, but they would find something far more dangerous." "All units maintain full alert," James commanded. "Their recon is done. The next vehicles we see will be the attack force." His team acknowledged, each member moving to their assigned positions. The waiting was always the hardest part, but they had used the time well. The ranch was as ready as it could be. Through his command center screens, James watched the sun beginning to set. The cartel would likely attack at night, using their numbers and night vision equipment to maximum advantage. They wouldn't realize that darkness would only make his team more lethal. Shadow lay at his feet, the dog's muscles tense with anticipation. Like his master, Shadow sensed the approaching conflict. The calm before the storm was coming to an end. "This is it," James spoke softly to his team. "Whatever they bring, however many they send, remember, we're not just defending a ranch anymore. We're sending a message that will echo through every cartel operation in the region. Some targets aren't worth any price." Just before midnight, the cartel's main force began their approach. Through his thermal imaging, James watched an unprecedented convoy of vehicles moving toward his ranch. The cartel had assembled a small army, far larger than anything they had previously committed, to a single operation. "I count 70-plus vehicles," Sarah reported from her observation position. "Multiple heavy weapons platforms, at least 3 mounted anti-material rifles. They've got something big on those rear trucks, possibly light artillery." James studied the tactical display, noting the professional deployment of their forces. The cartel had learned from their previous failure. They were establishing proper support positions, setting up interlocking fields of fire, creating a proper military-style operation. "They're not taking any chances this time," Marcus observed through the comm. "Those are professional military formations. They've brought in real operators for this one." Through the high-powered microphones, James could hear their communications, a mix of Spanish and English, with clear command and control structures in place. This wasn't just a cartel attack force, it was a proper military operation. "All units maintain radio discipline," James ordered. "Let them get fully committed before we reveal anything. Remember your fallback positions and escape routes." The cartel force began their deployment with methodical precision. Heavy weapons teams set up in elevated positions, while assault teams prepared for their advance. Their coordination suggested extensive planning and preparation. Multiple thermal signatures moving through the tree line, Sarah updated. They're inserting special operations teams ahead of the main force. James watched through his command center as the cartel's elite teams moved forward. They were good, using proper techniques for concealment and movement, but they were moving exactly where he had predicted they would. Mike, status on the remote stations? All green, Mike replied quietly. They're walking right into the primary kill zones. Just say the word. The cartel's main force had now fully deployed, their vehicles forming a loose semicircle around the ranch. James counted at least 200 men, with more still arriving. They had brought enough firepower to level a small town. A familiar voice came over their surveillance system, Carlos, speaking to what appeared to be the operations commander. The ranch is heavily fortified, but we've mapped their defensive positions. They can't possibly cover every angle with their numbers. The new commander, a tall figure wearing advanced tactical gear, nodded. They're good, but they're still just a handful of men. No one can stand against this much firepower. Begin the artillery barrage. The first shells arced through the night sky, their trajectories precise and calculated. They were using sophisticated fire control systems, targeting what they believed were key defensive positions. Hold positions, James commanded, as explosions began to rock the ranch. Let them think it's working. The artillery barrage continued for 20 minutes, systematically targeting every visible defensive position. The cartel forces waited patiently, believing they were softening up their target. They're staging for the main assault, Sarah reported. 3 primary attack groups, each with vehicle support. They're bringing up their specialist teams now. James watched as the cartel forces began their advance. They moved with professional discipline, using their superior numbers to establish overlapping fields of fire. Under normal circumstances, their approach would have been overwhelming. All units prepare for Phase 1, James ordered. Remember, we're not trying to stop them yet, just make them commit fully to the attack. The cartel's advance continued, their confidence growing as they encountered no resistance. Their heavy weapons teams provided covering fire, while assault teams moved forward in textbook fashion. They're almost in position, Marcus reported. Primary teams are approaching. The outer markers. James waited until the cartel forces had fully committed to their assault pattern. Their formation was perfect, exactly as he had anticipated. They had brought overwhelming force, but they had walked right into his trap. Execute Phase 1, James commanded. Instantly, the ranch's true defensive systems activated. Hidden charges detonated in carefully planned sequences, cutting off the cartel's planned escape routes. Remote weapon stations opened fire from unexpected angles, forcing their assault teams into prepared kill zones. Multiple targets down, Mike reported calmly. They're trying to fall back to secondary positions, but the pre-sighted fields are working perfectly. The cartel forces' professional discipline began to waver as they realized their careful planning had been turned against them. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they couldn't effectively bring their forces to bear. Sarah, initiate the drone swarm, James ordered. Dozens of micro-drones launched simultaneously, their synchronized movements creating chaos among the cartel forces. These weren't just surveillance platforms. They were carrying specialized electronic warfare packages, disrupting communications and night vision equipment. Through his command center screens, James watched as the cartel's carefully planned assault began to disintegrate. They had brought an army, but they were fighting on his terms, in his territory, against defenses they couldn't have possibly anticipated. All units, James spoke into his radio, prepare for Phase 2. Show them what happens when they bring an army to a SEAL fight. The final phase of the battle unfolded with devastating precision. James's team executed their coordinated defense, with the expertise of veteran special operators, systematically dismantling the cartel's overwhelming force through superior tactics and preparation. Multiple targets retreating from the east sector, Sarah reported through the comm. Their command structure is breaking down. No coordinated response to our counterattacks. The cartel forces found themselves caught in a nightmare scenario. Their superior numbers had become a liability, their forces too densely packed in the pre-planned kill zones. Every attempt to regroup or establish new positions was met with precise, devastating fire from multiple angles. Vehicle group trying to push through the north barrier, Marcus called out. They're getting desperate. James watched through his thermal imaging as several cartel vehicles attempted to break through his defensive perimeter. They didn't realize they were driving straight into one of his specialized trap zones. "Mike, light them up," James ordered calmly. The hidden anti-vehicle measures activated, disabled the cartel's vehicles with targeted EMP charges. The soldiers inside scrambled out, only to find themselves exposed to interlocking fields of fire. Through his command center feeds, James could hear the cartel commander screaming orders, trying to regain control of the deteriorating situation. But it was too late. Their carefully planned assault had transformed into chaos. "Carlos is making a break for it," Sarah reported, taking their remaining special operations team through the western ravine. "Let him go," James replied. "He needs to report what happened here. Make sure he has a clear view of what's about to happen to their artillery positions." The cartel's artillery teams, which had been providing supporting fire throughout the battle, suddenly found their positions targeted by precision counter-battery fire. James's team had located and ranged every piece before the battle began. "Artillery teams are abandoning their positions," Tom reported. "They're leaving everything behind. Looks like a full retreat in the southern sector." The cartel forces' retreat was rapidly becoming a rout. Their superior numbers meant nothing now. They were simply providing more targets for James's interlocking defensive systems. "All units, maintain pressure," James commanded. "Don't let them regroup. Show them the cost of their mistake." The night was illuminated by explosions and weapons fire as the cartel forces attempted to disengage. Their vehicles, those that could still move, were abandoning their dismounted troops, creating even more chaos in their ranks. Shadow remained alert at James's side, the dog's training evident in his focused attention. Like his master, he sensed the battle was reaching its climax. "Multiple surrenders in progress," Marcus reported. They're throwing down weapons and calling for ceasefire. James watched through his thermal imaging as groups of cartel soldiers began surrendering. The fight had been taken out of them. They had come expecting to overwhelm a fortified position, not face a sophisticated defense that turned their own tactics against them. "Sarah, get me a final count," James ordered. 30-plus vehicles destroyed or disabled, she reported. At least 50 confirmed surrenders. The rest are in full retreat. They're leaving behind most of their heavy equipment. The cartel's attempt to overwhelm the ranch with superior force had failed completely. They had brought an army, but they had faced something they couldn't overcome with mere numbers. Years of special operations experience and meticulous preparation. "All units, secure the prisoners and establish a perimeter," James commanded. "But stay alert. Make sure this isn't a fake retreat." As his team moved to secure the battlefield, James reflected on the message they had sent. The cartel had committed significant resources to this operation, brought in professional operators, and deployed military-grade hardware. Their defeat would resonate through the criminal underworld. "FBI response team is 20 minutes out," Sarah updated. "They're going to have a field day with all this captured equipment." James knew this victory would have lasting consequences. The cartel had lost not just men and equipment, but also their aura of invincibility. They had been defeated so thoroughly that their reputation would suffer throughout the region. "Stand down from full alert," James ordered his team, "but maintain security protocols. This isn't over, it's just changing phases." As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, James surveyed the aftermath of the night's combat. His ranch had held, his team had performed flawlessly, and they had sent an unmistakable message. Some targets weren't worth any price. The cartel would have to make a decision now. They could either accept their defeat and withdraw completely, or they could escalate further and risk drawing even more federal attention. Either way, they had learned a costly lesson about underestimating their opponents. Dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and red as James watched the last of the cartel forces disappear into the distance. His ranch had become a battlefield, but it had also become something else, a symbol of resistance against those who thought they could take whatever they wanted through force and intimidation. "Secure the perimeter," James spoke into his radio one final time. "We've won this battle, but stay ready. Men like El Cuervo don't accept defeat easily. This may be the end of the battle, but the war, that's just beginning." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.